I'm Erica Schmidt. I am a child and adult analyst at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, and it's my privilege and pleasure to be the moderator here this evening. We're going to talk today about the legacy of Freud and the way in which Freud founded psychoanalysis in the image of the modern science of his day. Freud, of course, was always aware of the need to ensure a future for psychoanalysis, and he was intent on establishing its scientific credibility. Freud recognized how controversial the psychoanalytic concepts he had developed were: the role of infantile sexuality in development, the fact that wishes and fantasies govern our thoughts and behaviors at an unconscious level, that the motivational force of our daily life and action is out of our awareness, and that free association and analysis of the transference are ways, the psychoanalytic methodology to gain access to this repressed instinctual life. And one way to ensure a future for psychoanalysis, which of course is what we're talking about today, was to anchor it in the professional disciplines of the day and to formulate them as scientific. At the same time, Freud recognized the challenge of applying scientific thinking to emotional life and to subjective experience. I happen to be rereading Civilization and Its Discontents, and in the opening pages of that book, he says, there's a quote, "It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings," which of course is the challenge we have. Now, in the modern science of our day, psychoanalysis is criticized as failing to meet standards of evidence-based practice, and it's also criticized as irrelevant by the discoveries of the biology of emotional disorders and biologically based interventions to treat them. At the same time, psychoanalysis faces the internal challenges from within the profession of theoretical pluralism and political battles about the basic definitions of what constitutes psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic practice. Today's panelists have been asked to consider how psychoanalysis has responded to these challenges from outside the profession and from within. What is the scientific status of psychoanalysis today? If the standards of the natural sciences, namely verification and replicability, are used, do we overlook what is most distinctive and valuable about psychotherapy? Its emphasis on self-knowledge and autonomy and personal meaning. If psychoanalysis is a science of subjectivity, what justifies its insights and method of inquiry? Is a return to the natural sciences possible or desirable? Now, there's an undated note that was found in Freud's papers after he died, and it's speculated that it was written after his arrival in England in 1938, when he, of course, was living in exile and was suffering from a terminal illness. And it touches on our topic for today. He wrote then, "Science humbles the individual. Greatness shrinks before the difficulties of acquiring real knowledge. Each individual can conquer only a small area. Each must go astray after a certain point. Only the succeeding generations can do it properly." So that's what we're going to do today. These are the succeeding generations post-Freud, and the four panelists that we have with us today are all practicing psychoanalysts, and they are all major contributors to the contemporary science of psychoanalysis. So the format for our panel today is going to be, each speaker is going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then at the end of that, we're going to have a brief discussion among all four of them. I think I'll ask them all to respond to each other and see what emerges from that, and then we'll give the audience an opportunity to speak as well. So the first speaker is going to be Robert Gallitzer-Levy, who is a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral science here at the University of Chicago. He is a training analyst on the faculty of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, and he is also the leader of something that you all may be interested in, a seminar called Reading Freud that meets monthly on Wednesday evenings for anyone who's interested in participating. It's a totally open seminar for anyone who wants to simply read Freud together. So.
So I'm going to try to give a 3-hour paper in 15 minutes. The title of this session is actually derived from a paper that Bert Kohler and I first gave 20 years ago at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, with exactly the same title, What Kind of Science is Psychoanalysis? And the reason we named it that way was because at that point in history, psychoanalysis was on the one hand under vigorous attack externally by people like Adolf Grunbaum, who claimed on a philosophical basis that it wasn't scientific, and perhaps more seriously internally, it was under attack from an extension of what Freud had called a point of view of it being our science, that is, in which professional authority had taken the place of research and finding out new information as the basis for psychoanalytic claims. And so we put together this paper for the AAAS, subsequently was published about 15 years later in Psychoanalytic Inquiry. And what we talked about were two things. First, whether psychoanalysis was a science, which is contingent, obviously, on what one means by science. And we mean something very simple, which goes back to Francis Bacon, which is a science is a discipline in which evidence is provided, which can be provided in some sort of public fashion. I can show you why I believe something, and I can show you the arguments upon which I make assertions. That's all there is to science. Bacon differentiated it from religious or revealed knowledge in which authority declared what the truth was. So insofar as psychoanalysis brings to a public forum the evidence for its views and allows you to follow the means by which conclusions are drawn from that evidence, I will contend that it's a science. But it's obviously a somewhat different kind of science from physics, chemistry, biology. It's what we called a human science. That is, a science in which the explanatory concepts are distinctly different from those of physics and chemistry. In particular, the explanations are in terms of concepts like motive, wish, intention, subjectivity, the experience of people, and in particular, the ways they make meaning out of experience. Psychoanalysis, as I will define it or think about it, is a science that explores meaning, how meanings are made and why people make meaning of experience. Now, this general approach entails taking the data, psychoanalytic data, which is both data from the couch, but also data from observing culture, observing creative activity, taking data from the political arena, and searching after meaning in that data. How does that material have meaning, as opposed to what is the mechanism by which that data is transformed into something else. And that naturally leads to the question of how do you determine to what extent you're doing good science, or why is a hermeneutic to be valued or not valued? You see, if I say, well, the patient is behaving in such and such a way because of the curse of the grandparents that fell upon the patient by virtue of the evil that the grandparents did. That's not, from a psychoanalytic point of view, a very satisfactory type of explanation. Why is it not a satisfactory explanation? Why, for example, is it a satisfactory explanation to say that when, as a 4-year-old, the child experienced desire about which it felt guilty and endangered, and subsequently instituted symptoms to avoid being aware of that experience? Why is that a good explanation? And I'm going to give a rather what may seem like an unsatisfactory basis for this, but it's the basis on which psychoanalysts work, which is that the narrative is of a satisfactory kind. There are certain stories which make sense, which seem to fit, which work well as explanations. And it's those group of stories which are groups of stories, the narrative satisfactoriness of the formulation, which constitutes the test of its validity. Now, many people would say, that's not what science is supposed to be. And I can back that up just a little further in support of it. You see, when the positivist scientist says, I believe thus and such because I followed the methodology of the received methodology for scientific investigation, or because I have statistical evidence for this or that. That's not really quite the truth. The truth is that the scientist is saying, I'm willing to risk my reputation and people's opinions of me and my professional career, and in the case of medicine or medicine-like fields, the well-being of my patients on my conviction about that. So the scientist's decision to believe something is really a sociological decision. And all I'm saying is that the psychoanalyst's decision about whether something is true or correct has a different sociologic basis, that it's based in the satisfactoriness of a hermeneutic or narrative understanding of the material that's going on. Now, there's an obvious question that arises here, and I'm deliberately being provocative for the benefit of my fellow panelists. In recent years, there's been a great deal that's been said about behavior and psychological functioning that is linked to both neuroscience and also to a field I'm particularly interested in, nonlinear dynamics or chaos theory. We can both fields have an enormous amount to say about human behavior and human action, and there's an enthusiasm for integrating them with psychoanalysis. And I'm going to suggest that that's an activity that needs to be undertaken with particular caution, because if I am claiming that psychoanalysis is a human science that is based on the narrative adequacy of the explanations it provides, whose range of discourse has to do with motives, intentions, and meaning, then where does neuroscience fit in that? Where does nonlinear dynamics, among other things, fit in that? And here's my own answer to that, which is simply this. In raw form, it doesn't. That is, that's a different kind and different style of discourse that isn't part of psychoanalysis. So you may ask, why are most of my publications about nonlinear dynamics? And the answer is that I believe both neuroscience and nonlinear dynamics provide us with additional narratives, that the narratives that come out of both of these fields are such that we have new kinds of stories that are possible, because what constitutes a satisfactory narrative is highly culturally contingent. Freud's work, Freud's own discovery of psychoanalysis, was based on an idea of continuity. That is, that if you had a stimulus such as the analyst's behavior and the patient's response, which seemed not to be clearly connected to it, there was an assumption that there must be an underlying connection, and that underlying connection he referred to as the dynamic unconscious. That this, essentially he said, there are kinds of the stories he would prescribe or was interested in involved continuities in the world, continuities which were invisible and for which he looked. Now, for example, nonlinear dynamics teaches us that the worldview that things are continuous and smooth in their transitions is simply a limited worldview, a specific worldview that came out of the Newtonian physics, and Newtonian physics becoming part of common sense. So nonlinear dynamics gives us a bunch of new and richer narratives than we had previously. Similarly, I believe that neuroscience gives us a bunch of reasonable narratives, not about neuroscience, but ideas of how the mind might operate, stories of how the mind might operate, which are distinct and new and are suggested by that field. But it doesn't make psychoanalysis correct because it finds evidence in neuroscience. All neuroscience, I would contend, does for us is provide us with some more and some interesting narratives. It provides us with new hermeneutic tools. Now, I'll finish up with a remark having to do with someone might well say to me, well, Bob, why the heck do you want to limit psychoanalysis in the way you're describing? Why do you want to constrict its boundaries? Wouldn't it be great to have particularly all this stuff that has lots of prestige integrated into psychoanalytic thinking? And I'll tell you why I want to do that. There are basically two reasons. One is, I think we're very, very far away from having exhausted the hermeneutic investigation of psychological functioning. And whenever we make a step towards some other discipline, what we're doing is giving up on our capacity for deeper hermeneutic exploration. When Freud, for example, says, I can explain these phenomena by an underlying concept of drives, which are related to biology. What he's doing is basically saying, I can't go deeper than this. And that's something I want to discourage us from doing. I want to keep driving us in the direction of better hermeneutic and deeper hermeneutic explorations. The second is that the psychoanalyst, like everyone else, wants to gain social power through the prestige of what we do. And this leads, I think, to temptation to overstep our ideas of what we know and to say that we know more than in fact we do. I think that's a particular risk when there are these lovely metaphors from neuroscience and from nonlinear dynamics, also from some other fields, where we want the world to believe us, and we want to ally ourselves with people who seem convincing. Science has inordinate prestige. Normal science, as I'll call it, has enormous prestige. And I think we're better off avoiding bringing that prestige to ourselves, because it interferes with the kind of critical inquiry that I believe is at the very heart of psychoanalysis. So I'll stop there because I think I've done about 15 minutes worth. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker on the panel is Erwin Hoffman. Erwin is on the faculty of the Chicago Center for Psychoanalysis and the University of Illinois Department of Psychiatry and the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. He is a well-known commentator on issues in the scientific understanding of psychoanalysis, and you know, when you ask a psychoanalyst how they'd like to be introduced, you get all sorts of interesting answers from that person and others. So I was told Erwin is a gadfly of psychoanalysis, which I think is an apt description, and also, right, Frank said that, and his second son is getting married in 2 weeks, so we're lucky to have him here today.
I'm going to read something. I'll have to read it a little fast to make it in the time limit, even my extended 20-minute time limit. So forgive me, but I'll try to read it with expression. I believe I was invited to be on this panel largely on the strength of my plenary address to the American Psychoanalytic Association in 2007, published later in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association in 2009. That paper was entitled Double Thinking Our Way to Scientific Legitimacy, The Desiccation of Human Experience. Double thinking is from Orwell. I'll be reading an alloy of excerpts from that paper, as well as one or two others, and some new editing and additions. But before I get to that alloy, I want to state as succinctly as I can 3 ways that I think the choice between a positivist or objectivist or technically rational epistemological paradigm as distinct from a critical constructivist or hermeneutic paradigm for psychoanalysis has moral and political consequences. In Technical Rationality, which Donald Schoen argues has been regrettably the dominant paradigm governing all Western professional practice, not just psychiatric or psychoanalytic practice, there's a view that people suffer from one or another disorder. The disorder is considered to be relatively homogeneous across individuals, and there's a way of treating it, established allegedly via the authority of research findings or clinical experience, or the opinion of highly regarded clinical theorists in the field. There's a way of treating it through medication or one or another approach prescribing how one should relate to that person to achieve a good outcome. I believe this perspective has been dominant even in psychoanalysis, where its scientistic expressions, by the way, the paper is called Psychoanalytic Scientism, where its scientific expressions are more subtle than those associated with manualized treatment approaches characterizing certain versions of cognitive behavioral therapy and other types of evidence-based treatment. Now, here are 3 moral political consequences of technical rationality as it bears on individual psychoanalytic therapy and psychoanalysis. 1, essentializing people diagnostically. Essentializing is a neologism that I find useful. Versus respecting and exploring the consequential uniqueness of each person's experience and potentials and of the analytic encounter at each moment. By the way, I'm talking about analytic process. You know, Bob was talking about, truths that psychoanalysis establishes about human beings, right? I think more. I'm talking specifically about what we call treatment, right? Specifically. The analyst or therapist is encouraged to think largely in terms of treating a disorder rather than in terms of relating to a unique individual. The person is, in effect, reduced to certain traits or dynamics that he or she allegedly shares in common with others who suffer from this condition. Technical rationality pulls in the direction of essentialism. That is, the person suffers from essentially this or that, or even the person is essentially a case of this or that. And I think it has features in common with other morally objectionable isms, like classism, racism, sexism, and so on, where a trait provides the grounds for reduction and simplification, and potential degradation and dehumanization. The analyst's or therapist's uniqueness is also rendered inconsequential, since he or she is called upon to apply standardized ways of relating that constitute the treatments of choice for these disorders. 2, this is the second implication of technical rationality. Medicalizing versus recognizing agency, creativity, and moral responsibility. Technical rationality gravitates toward medicalizing a condition or disorder so that the person's agency and responsibility for it are reduced or eliminated. As a result, it removes the emotional states and the actions associated with them from the arena of moral struggle. How much depression is warranted if a person feels overworked and underpaid? How much anxiety is warranted if a person feels angry but knows that certain expressions of his or her anger might get him or her fired? Or how much depression or anxiety are warranted if a person high up in management feels bad about pushing the workers under him or her to do more than what makes sense for their psychological or physical well-being? The sooner you can throw people into the existential black hole of dysthymic disorder or major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, the sooner you have their feelings and attitudes transformed into diseases, a transformation that encourages both the patient's passivity and the status quo with respect to the environment in which these affects arise. And again, the analytic therapist as a whole person capable of creative agency, moral judgment, and proactive interest in social critique and change is rendered irrelevant in this medicalized context. 3, individualizing and focusing on the analytic dyad and family history versus critical thinking about the socio-political environment. Medicalized or not, the focus on the individual, that factor alone, abstracted from the socio-political context in which he or she lives, automatically pulls toward the locating of the problem in that individual, while encouraging inattention to or denial of the destructive aspects of the socio-political environment in which the person lives and to which he or she is pressured to or forced to adapt. To the extent that the relational movement in psychoanalysis, which I identify with myself, has emphasized the intersubjective nature of the analytic process and of childhood history in the context of family dynamics, without attending to the political surround, and without reflecting critically on the psychoanalytic enterprise itself as one that may be in collusion with certain destructive aspects of our culture. To the extent that that's the case, I agree with Botticelli and others that it fails to realize its potential power as a critical consciousness-raising force in our culture. Now, here are 3 clinical stories that touch on these interrelated ramifications of technical rationality: essentializing, medicalizing, and individualizing. The first and second vignettes are from the paper in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association that I mentioned in 2009. I recently had an experience with a patient, Neil, a gentleman in his 70s who struggled with a pattern of behavior that seemed to fit well with the diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder. I referred him to a psychopharmacologist for medication, which he reluctantly agreed might help, given his feeling that his sporadic attacks of rage were overreactions completely beyond his control. A couple of days later, he called to tell me he had just had what promised to be his last attack. He was outraged when, over the phone, the psychopharmacologist told him his fee, exorbitant by the patient's standards, and he blew up in his characteristic way an explosion exacerbated by what Neil felt was this doctor's condescending attitude. He now pledged to manage his temper on his own, without the benefit of, as he put it, any fucking medication. I said, "But Neil, I thought it was out of your control." To which he replied, "I changed my mind." What a powerful phrase when you think about it. I changed my mind. Think about that. Our language often has more wisdom in it than we notice. Since that time, the episodes have been dramatically reduced to about 20% of their previous frequency, according to the patient's report. Had the fee been lower, and had Neil liked the psychiatrist better, he probably would have ended up with medication that surely would have been credited with any ensuing improvement. As it turned out, the treatment of choice was referral to a psychopharmacologist with an exorbitant fee and a condescending attitude. Should we do a study to see how frequently that works? Another patient, a suburban housewife and mother of 5, after describing her attacks of anxiety as the most terrible thing she has ever experienced, told me in about the 3rd or 4th session that there was something about them that she had to admit she liked in a weird sort of way, quote unquote. In the midst of the attack, she would have a sense of unreality in which she would ask herself, who am I? Who are these 5 kids? What am I doing in this house? It created a sense of detachment that was sort of what she wanted. That is, she wanted to escape from a world in which she felt totally trapped, and this was her way of doing it. So you'll say, undoubtedly there's got to be a better way. Fine, let's say that's true. But does anyone know what that better way is for her? Is there some reasonable time that it should take for the two of us to find it? Because until she finds it, she might very well hang on for dear life, for the life of her soul, to those terrifying episodes of detachment. Here's the 3rd vignette. In a personal communication some time ago, I had commented on a published case report by Lynn Layton, surely one of our leaders on the interface of psychoanalysis and politics. That personal communication and its effects on Lynn's subsequent work are reported in papers by Lynn and by me that are now in press with psychoanalytic dialogues. Layton's published account of the original paper that I commented on in the personal communication entails work with a patient, a highly paid female executive who used to work herself to the bone at the expense of time for herself, time for reflection, time for relationships. In the course of the therapy, she became more aware of how driven she was and began to ease up a bit to try to create a better quality of life for herself. These changes, however, did not affect her attitude towards her hard-working subordinates. She didn't think that the standards that applied to management should apply to workers. Indeed, it was important that they work as much as possible in order for the company to maximize its profits. Even experiences in which she herself felt painfully exploited in life did not lead to empathic identification with her workers. Layton notes that she is, quotes, aware, listen to this, aware that the treatment could, in the end, enable the patient to feel more at ease being less accountable as she becomes more comfortable with her identification as a boss. The identification as boss would then successfully block identification with, and thus empathy with, her employees, close quote. Layton continues, quote, but I wonder what will happen as she increasingly recognizes that what she calls optimizing time and money is at odds with what she deems best for her soul and for her relationships with others, close quote. What struck me was Layton's psychoanalytically normative passivity and appearance, at least, of neutrality. I sense in that wondering what will happen a kind of analytic, neutral patience, what I have called, quote, a stereotypic, stylized posture of psychoanalytic, hyper, unperturbed calm, close quote. A posture that is so common, again, like the water to the fish, that it can readily escape critical scrutiny. I think this is what Leighton herself calls the normative unconscious. At work. With some hyperbolic license to make the point dramatically, I wondered in my personal communication to Lynn why she didn't exclaim to this patient, quote, quoting the hypothetical, right? "Are you out of your mind? You've been telling me for years about how empty and constricted your own life had become with your hypertrophied work ethic, but you have no compunction about forcing that life on your subordinates? Also, you talk as though you are not the slightest bit concerned about how I might feel about what you are telling me. Do you think I'm some kind of robot?" I thought that might be a good, if evocative way to start some exploratory work with the analyst engaged as a whole, living, morally conscious, and passionate human being. Now I'm going back to the double thinking essay in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association in 2009. Our work as analysts often entails joining our patients in their struggles with such conflict, including close attention to associated moral, political, and existential issues. When we as analysts and as analysts, and remember we are both, that is those of us who are analytic therapists, when we resist, as the relational movement at its best encourages us to do, the reification of emotional disorders as abnormalities located in us as individuals, we open the door to critical appraisal of the socio-political context in which we are embedded. We may be complicit in sustaining those contexts, however disordered, however destructive they may be. As feminist theorists have argued with respect to hysteria, maybe our own alleged symptoms can be construed as in part conflicted unconscious protest against inconvenient truths, not only about our childhood histories, and not only about the inescapable existential realities of the human condition, but also about the particular socio-political arrangements that constitute our collective, perhaps seriously impaired holding environments. Our attachment to those environments in which, among other things, extreme consumerism and individualism are prominent, in addition to state-sponsored classism, racism, violent imperialism, and egregious species-threatening environmental irresponsibility. That attachment may have much in common with stubborn attachments to bad objects. The new Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, the PDM, supposedly a vast improvement over the DSM, but really not. And the kind of research it encourages offers seductive rewards for the perpetuation of what might qualify as subtle sadomasochistic complicity with certain organizations of power in our society. Separating ourselves from that world and trying to create and attach to something new and better may entail extremely hard and conflictual mutual analytic work with the potential, however, for raised social consciousness and ultimately constructive political action. The whole person of the following are some further reflections on the role of systematic empirical research as it applies to psychoanalytic practice as compared with the place of case studies and clinical experience generally. The whole person of the treatment provider, of the analyst or analytic therapist, is at the heart of what is relevant in engaging with a person struggling with problems in living, whereas in the treatment of a physical disorder, it's a specific technical expertise that is likely to matter most. In other words, it's likely that the active ingredients in the treatment of many medical conditions can be safely decontextualized to the extent that their relevant meaning does not vary from one practitioner to another. A certain antibiotic should work with a certain kind of infection no matter who prescribes it. But the meaning of an analyst's interpersonal behavior, whether listening or interpreting or exploring or self-disclosing or relating in other ways, is context-dependent, and one of the relevant contexts is the whole person engaging in that behavior. That is why the fact that systematic quantitative studies cannot control for who the therapist is detracts substantially from their scientific and pragmatic value. Conversely, the fact that case studies do allow for consideration of the person of the therapist as he or she engages in the process goes a long way toward contributing to their special scientific power, notwithstanding whatever limitations they may have. Of course, the same argument that applies to the analyst applies to the patient and to each moment of the encounter. Systematic empirical studies simply do not control for the consequential uniqueness of the analyst, of the patient, of their relationship, and of the moment. I'm reminded of this statement by Hans Strupp toward the end of a distinguished career devoted to psychotherapy research. Quote, given the uniqueness of every therapeutic diet and the multitude of relevant interacting variables influencing the course of treatment, the empirical validation of any therapy is utterly illusory. Close quote. Hans Strupp. I know that many may then ask, if the principle of consequential uniqueness is so decisive, how can one learn anything from systematic empirical research, or for that matter from case studies? And how can any progress be made in accruing knowledge over time? The answer must be something between, at one extreme, simply applying in a mechanical way an approach that seems to have had therapeutic value for another allegedly matched patient-analyst diet or sample of such diets, or even as in single case designs, the same diet at a different moment in time, and at the other extreme, flying by the seat of one's pants with no guidelines whatsoever. What is required is as much knowledge and sophistication as one can muster regarding the cogent possibilities to consider in terms of understanding as well as ways of relating to our patients, and at the same time the assumption of responsibility for creative participation, honoring the uniqueness of each person and each moment. Maybe a way to formulate this challenge is to say that we aspire to a kind of grounded and responsible, and here I would add morally and politically responsible, yet free and creative relational engagement. The grounding and the creativity constitute an ongoing dialectic. What can develop over time is a kind of responsive, yet also critical, moral, and creative sensibility. In keeping with this view of the kind of advance we should aspire to in our field, I've become interested in something I call nonlinear constructivist learning, or NCL. I figure if I give it initials, it'll like take in the culture. NCL. Stimulated by clinical experiences of our own as patients or as analysts, or those of others, or by something we've read or encountered, a piece of systematic empirical research, something in a play or film, or something about our socio-political environment, we have a new heightened readiness to respond in a certain kind of situation in a different way. When this readiness may come into play is not predictable. A certain confluence of events, something the patient presents, something about our mood and state of mind at a certain moment, some entirely fortuitous event right before a session, leads to that response, a kind of understanding or way of participating that might not otherwise have emerged. What we do now is an improvised, creative offshoot of what we encountered previously that is adapted to our sense of this unique moment. Over time, instances of nonlinear constructivist learning accumulate. What evolves is not linear progress, but the development of one's sensibility and perhaps one's wisdom as they color one's ways of being in the context of the analytic relationship. This kind of development applies to the patient as well as the analyst. Psychoanalytic conversations can be enriching of people's lives because they entail reflection on many issues. Such reflection is of value intrinsically. It is not merely a means to an end, but an end in itself. Yet changes, including symptom reduction, might come about as a byproduct. If such a basically non-instrumental view of the psychoanalytic experience jeopardizes medical health insurance coverage, which do we discard? The view or the coverage? Perhaps at a minimum, we shouldn't discard serious dialogue about it. Thank you.
Is this work? Okay, this is working. In continuing our serious dialogue about this, let me now introduce Fred Levin, who is on the faculty of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, and he's also where he's a training analyst and a faculty member. He's also a professor at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine and a brain researcher, and the author of over 300 articles and 25 books. Fred?
This is a tough act to follow. So You'll forgive me if I jump around a bit, but I think the members of this panel, including those who have not yet spoken, are very sharp and totally dedicated to what they're doing. That means not only helping patients, but trying to grow individually. If we don't grow, we can't help anybody. We have to continue to learn all through our careers. So the question then is, who do we listen to and how do we grow? I think one way we grow is by listening very much to the patients, and if we have a good relationship with the patient and they feel a good relationship with us, it's amazing how the patient can remind us of our own mistakes and our own successes. That is, we connect with each other. And I want to mention something that blew my mind away in this regard. I was thinking about some of the wonderful people that I had an opportunity to meet during my career, people who were teachers of mine at one time or another. Eric Kandel played a role in that regard. All of you may or may not know Eric Kandel individually. He's obviously very famous now. He developed the ideas that have to do with putting new requirements on the table for our learning about our psychoanalytic practice, and including in that, adding neuroscience to the psychoanalytic piece. When the journal, most of the journals of international reputation became neuropsychoanalysis, okay? In the past year, it included a requirement that everybody who is training in psychoanalysis, okay, has to become knowledgeable with regard to not only the traditional teachings of psychoanalysis, but the new ideas that are there as well. And if you don't take a course in neuroscience at your analytic institute, you are not recognized as an analyst under the International Psychoanalytic Association rules. That may not apply to everybody in this room, but I'm just mentioning. That was the thought. And Eric Kandel took the, in some sense, politically not a smart one to take. If you want to be friendly to everybody, he took the position of trying to get everybody interested in understanding neuroscience. That resulted in some people responding, thinking that that was a wonderful idea to introduce because it's a complicated topic and it's hard to pull together. So Eric took it very seriously, and I remember reading a journal, and Eric was talking about an article I had written when I was a resident. I can't tell you how much it kind of blew me away, and that he would pay attention. And I've seen him write articles, and I often have read those articles. I have never read one that I didn't learn from. And I started to get more and more interested in the brain and in neuroscience. Eric is one of the only psychoanalysts in history that has won the Nobel Prize. He won that a couple years back, and that was amazing. And I think others in this room will go on to win prizes like that. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, what's going to motivate each of us in order to perform as well as we can in this job that we have been attracted to and enjoy so much? How do we get the effects that we think we need to get? I think it's not so easy, but I think one thing is respecting the unusually talented work by researchers. Even if at first, when we read them, we don't fully understand what they're about and what they're trying to say. It took me a while to be able to understand Eric's work. But I think it's extremely important because it raises questions about aspects of what happens in analysis that we could not answer any other way except by continuing the scientific work that Freud began a long time ago. Freud was a brain scientist. That was a critical part of his identity. Anna Freud was too. I know because I corresponded with Anna. And I asked her lots of questions, and to her credit, she wrote me back and answered. And someday I'll talk more about that. But the point is, when people who are geniuses at something really put an enormous effort into what they're doing, they come up with some very stimulating ideas. The ideas may not be perfect in the sense that they don't cover everything we need to know, but they're extraordinarily important in inviting us to ask questions we might not otherwise ever ask. Incidentally, Eric Kandel was in the tough situation personally when he was a kid. You may not know this, but when his parents were captured by Hitler, he was put in Auschwitz-Buchenwald. His parents were allowed to go to America, and he was not. It was lucky that he survived that. In any event, though, if you think about what Eric is talking about, I think what he's trying to do is to put himself in the unique situation of looking at things like how we learn. What actually happens? What are the processes that occur? Now, to do that, what you have to do is to return to what in the beginning gave psychoanalysis its excitement. Because when Freud was writing about it, he was excited. Because what he was talking about in terms of the unconscious and the rediscovery of things that we repress and then are in a position to work through and grow, you couldn't do as a therapist-patient combo if you didn't understand the idea of having been traumatized and then having to work it out. The question is, what is it in Eric's invitation that is helpful, and what is it that many people might not find helpful? Obviously, you're free to talk about and ask questions as we finish up our talk, and you may have your own ideas in this area. But my sense is that everything that we talk about hinges on the brain. And one of the things that I found when I read this journal a year ago, Psychoanalytic Review, was that 4 people in the world were honored for their interest in neuropsychoanalysis. Eric republished his paper that he wrote, the one that won the Nobel Prize, in here. So you can read that too. And it was really amazing, you know, to go through the details of what that man has accomplished, what he's written, and how he has redescribed all the things that we traditionally know, going through them. If you ever have a chance to read his essays, they're mind-boggling and extremely accurate from a scientific perspective. I mean, especially the neuroscience is outstanding. After I graduated from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, studying anthropology, I felt up to going to some other cultures to continue to learn. I went to Germany and Austria and spent some time there. And I also went to Japan and graduated from Waseda University, Japanese university. So I'm fluent in Japanese. And that's where I met my wife, and we've been married for just about 50 years now. She was a classmate of mine at that university. I think at one level what I was doing was trying to make sure there weren't any Japs and Nazis around, that I wasn't in danger. Because when I was born in 1942, the Second World War began, and it was a very scary place. My mother was totally upset because everybody that she knew went off to fight in the war, and she was sure they would all come back in body bags. So nobody where I was knew that I needed glasses until I went to high school, and I was the stupidest kid in the school. If the teacher asked Fred, look at the board and tell us what the answer was, the students near me would say, don't ask Fred, he's stupid. And the teachers would recognize that and stop asking me questions. But once I got glasses from that wonderful teacher in 8th grade, who loaned me hers, it's amazing how things changed. And I went on to become valedictorian of my high school class and did very well academically. I think that's another reason why I wanted to keep studying in universities, to prove that I was intellectually adept. Now, a problem of that, though, is if you go into analysis with somebody, do you want to go into analysis with somebody who has to prove how smart he is? That's a problem. So it was good that I had a good analysis and graduated from our institute here in Chicago. And I think that put me at ease and helped me feel comfortable so I could just be there. But I think I've been especially helpful for people who are not sure if what they're doing is the right thing for them. Since things changed a lot for me and improved dramatically along the way, I am a big believer in being there with the patient and sharing feelings with each other. So I think the analyst should not be completely anonymous. And that way, the patient knows more sometimes where we're coming from, and we know where they're coming from. And I think if you do that, not all the time, but sometimes, it makes it a little more intelligible who we are, and the patient appreciates our understanding of who they are. Also, if you know neuropsychoanalysis, you're much more likely to make accurate diagnoses. For instance, a patient of mine suddenly became psychotic, and I'll finish on this one. The patient became psychotic, but I knew, since I had worked with her for 20 years, that there was no way she was schizophrenic. But the brain scientist part of me said, I bet her stomach is no longer making intrinsic factor. If you don't make intrinsic factor, if you stop making it, you no longer absorb B12 from your diet. And you will all become psychotic if that happens to you. And then all you need to do is to give yourself a shot each month, which I taught my patient to do. And she gives herself B12 once a month, and she's been completely normal ever since. So I think it's not a bad thing for analysts to know about the neuroscience piece. There are lots of puzzles that can be explained on that basis. One other thing. When I was at Waseda University, I became a close friend of the head of Tokyo University Medical School, which is right next to it. And he and I spoke often in Japanese and in English with each other. And he told me I should go to medical school, which I really appreciated from him. But the nice thing about that was that he is the person who became the world's expert on the cerebellum. And if you're going to read about the brain, especially ring about 3 areas. I'll call them A, B, and C. A is the amygdala, B is the basal ganglia, and C is the cerebellum. If you know what those 3 structures do, you will know the critical functions that matter. The cerebellum has 1 trillion brain cells. The brain has 1 trillion brain cells, but only 10% of them are cerebellar. But the cerebellum is the only system that has two-way communication with every system of the brain. In other words, it is what is in charge of your brain. So in the article I wrote in this same issue of the journal, where they nominated those prizes to the 4 of us, I was in a very nice position to think about what it meant to be part of a group that was pulling some things together. We don't imply that it's as important for everyone. It certainly is not. But for some of us, it's terribly important, because if you know how the basal ganglia, the amygdala, and the cerebellum work, everything becomes easier. And one of the key things, and then I'm done, the last thing I'll say is, in the case of the cerebellum, once it solves a problem, it really does so in a very amazing way. And for example, that's one of the reasons why when you've taken a medicine, you don't have to keep taking it. Give me 2 more sentences. You don't have to keep taking it because the cerebellum can reprogram any part of the brain it wants to, and once it sees you're taking a medicine that works, it figures out how the medicine works and reprograms your brain to do it without the medicine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. And as the spokesperson for neuroscience, I think he also makes a case for the narrative way of thinking about psychoanalysis. Our final speaker on this panel is Frank Summers. Frank is the president of the Division of Psychoanalysis of the American Psychological Association. He is a professor of clinical psychiatry and the behavioral sciences at Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. He is a supervising and training analyst at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis and at the Chicago Center for Psychoanalysis. He, like the others on our panel, is a major contributor to psychoanalytic theory and the practice of psychoanalysis in our contemporary world. His 4th book has just been published. It's titled The Psychoanalytic Vision, The Experiencing Subject, Transcendence, and the Therapeutic Process. And there are flyers here in the auditorium available and in the registration room if anyone's interested. We're delighted to have Frank be the final speaker on our panel this evening.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard here? The nature of any discipline is determined by its subject matter, and psychoanalysis is about the exploration of the experiencing subject. All the analyst's efforts to understand the patient's verbal and nonverbal behavior are adjudicated on the basis of the patient's experience. If the patient cannot experience the analyst's interpretation, the suggested understanding is either wrong or ill-timed, but it can make no claim to analytic knowledge without the patient's affective resonance. It is the knowledge claim that is key here. When we ask what kind of science is psychoanalysis, we are asking, what is its knowledge claim? The word science is rooted in the Latin scientia, or knowledge, and that is what science meant from the ancient world to the origins of modern science. The philosophical foundation of the modern scientific worldview was provided by Descartes, who divided the world into mind and matter. Descartes split consciousness, the subject of experience, from the natural world of objects. In this Cartesian metaphysics, natural science was the science of objects in homogeneous space, separated from the mind. By splitting the world into the mental and the physical, Descartes split subject and object. Thus, the foundation of modernism, and correlatively for the natural sciences, is Cartesian dualism. The spectacular achievements of those sciences led to their dominance in the modern age. However, confusion arose. Precisely because of the impressive advances in astronomy, physics, and other natural sciences, these sciences became synonymous with science, and the criterion for all legitimate knowledge became the experimental method. Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, formalized the conflation of all branches of knowledge into a single scientific method. Comte argued that the experimental method of the natural sciences constituted the appropriate investigative procedure for the human sciences. The latter became recognized as sciences to the degree that they could make knowledge claims based on natural scientific methods. To this day, one hears the question, is it science? Equated with, does it use the experimental methods of the natural sciences? As a result, the social sciences have attempted to mimic the natural sciences by employing experimentation and measurement. The unwarranted assumption that the method of the natural sciences is the only type of science and that the standard for all knowledge claims is the fallacy that we call scientism. Rather than deriving the method of any particular science from its subject matter, scientism assumes the method and judges every discipline according to its conformity to a preconceived method. As Henri Bergson showed more than 100 years ago, psychic states have no magnitude, so they cannot be measured, and therefore cannot be subject to experimentation in the sense of natural science. Any effort to measure psychological states is doomed to failure because psychic states have no extension. Claims to do so inevitably resort to measuring the neurophysiological correlate of the state, not the state itself. That's the reductionism that Erwin was talking about. Psychic states are known through human communication, verbal and nonverbal. If one wishes to understand the experience of a human being, the experimental method is not relevant because lived experience is not measurable and cannot be verified by experimentation. If hypothesis testing were necessary for human understanding, humans could not communicate with one another. One person utters a few sentences and the other stops by the drugstore to purchase toothpaste. No experimental method was either possible or necessary. Every instance of one person understanding another, every discovery or interpretation of historical events, and every biographical narrative demonstrate that new knowledge is won without an experiment being conducted. The listener, historian, biographer, interviewer, and many others gain knowledge by understanding the speech, acts, or documents of another or others. Here we have Dilthey's famous distinction between sciences of explanation and sciences of understanding. For Dilthey, the natural sciences are sciences of explanation because they search for laws that can be applied deductively to individual instances. When a law is discovered, it is then used to predict the behavior of the natural world, as in predicting force from knowledge of mass and acceleration, for example. By contrast, the human sciences have as their object of investigation lived experience, which cannot be grasped by laws or testing the hypotheses derived from them. Unlike natural sciences, the human sciences seek to discover meaning and are therefore sciences of understanding. The goal is not to explain, but to understand the meaning of psychological and social phenomena, and therefore the human sciences are, in essence, interpretive or hermeneutic disciplines. Psychoanalysis is the depth study of the experiencing subject. The truth to be gained in such an inquiry is the understanding of the behavior or symptom by rendering it intelligible. The criterion for the validity of any psychoanalytic claim to knowledge of the subject is its ability to render intelligible what has not been previously understood. The illumination of meaning takes place via the discovery of mental phenomena that demonstrate how the symptom coheres with the lived experience of the patient. In going from what is said to what is meant, psychoanalysis is by definition a hermeneutic discipline. This is precisely what Freud did in understanding a wide variety of neurotic symptoms. For example, Elizabeth von R could not walk, although her legs were physically capable, an unintelligible symptom, until Freud discovered that she was on a walk with her brother-in-law when her sister died, and she had the guilt-ridden thought, now he is free. The connection between her guilt over the positive reaction to her sister's death and the walk made intelligible what had been an inexplicable inability to use her legs. As can be seen, the purpose of analytic investigation is to find what behavior means, not to deduce it from an explanatory law. Consequently, the method for arriving at valid psychoanalytic knowledge is not the testing of hypotheses about general human tendencies, but the discovery of meaning that makes the mysterious intelligible. This is what psychoanalysis does. It expands awareness of previously hidden parts of the patient's psyche so that apparently nonsensical symptoms and other psychological phenomena can become sensical. That is, they fit the patient's life experiences. Analytic understanding has occurred not because an experiment has been conducted, but because hidden meaning has been unveiled that renders intelligible what had not before been comprehended. That does not make an analytic knowledge claim any less valid or legitimate than the discoveries of the natural sciences. It only makes it a different type of knowledge. To dispute psychoanalytic understanding because it is not derived from experimental test data is to commit the fallacy of scientism. In this way, the hermeneutic of psychoanalysis is based on the same inferential reasoning and criterion of coherence used in everyday discourse. Psychoanalysis, then, is a special method for discovering coherence, and therefore its knowledge is neither objective nor relative. Those terms are derived from an epistemology of objectivity that is relevant only to the sciences of explanation. One is reminded here of Aristotle's distinction between the three intellectual virtues, episteme, techne, and phronesis. Episteme is the search for laws, sciences of explanation. Techne is the art of craftsmanship. And phronesis is the art of virtue, learning how to conduct oneself properly. The natural science standard defines all science, including psychoanalysis, as episteme. In Aristotelian terms, psychoanalysis is a form, however, of phronesis. In closing, I wish to highlight the fact that while epistemology may seem far removed from the consulting room, the analyst's epistemological stance informs her clinical strategy. Those who hold a scientific view of psychoanalysis attempt to derive explanation from assumed laws. Such analytic deductivists are operating as though laws have been discovered, and the analytic process consists of finding instances of them. Now, this is not a straw man. One can find this replete in the literature. To give but a few brief examples, some classical analysts tend to find the Oedipal complex at the heart of neurosis, even if other formulations fit the data better. Some self-psychologists tend to assume idealization at the first indication of separation anxiety. And often Kleinians assume infantile defense mechanisms and longings when the patient expresses a need at almost any level. By contrast, the analyst who sees psychoanalysis as a science of understanding the experiencing subject will use theories as heuristic devices to open the exploration of meaning rather than close it off with an assumed explanation. It is this approach that marks the unique science of the subjective that is psychoanalysis and that cannot be reduced to any other science or branch of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to ask the panelists if they would like to respond to each other or are prompted to think of certain things in response to what they've heard as a first step here.
I have a lot to say.
Well, go for it.
I'm not going to say all of it. Well, with respect to Fred Levin's presentation, I want to just say this at the outset. I think it's unfortunate that neurophysiological courses are now required by the International Psychoanalytic Association. Yeah,
Erwin, can you speak?
Well, I think it's unfortunate. I think it's based on what Frank was talking about and what Bob is talking. It's based on an assumption of a kind of reductionism. That this is really, I've been in practice for 40 years. I don't know anything about neurophysiology. You'd be hard-pressed, I think, to show me how in some sessions that I conduct, they fall short because of my lack of knowledge of what's going on in the patient's brain. I think there's plenty to learn. One of the ways I differ with Bob is that it's a slight subtle difference. He made it sound a little bit like he's pulling his punches, like it's a matter of time. It's not yet. We don't know, and we still have a long way to go before we've exhausted the hermeneutic. That's like saying we've got a long way to go before we're done doing novels. I think a good course that's just as relevant, if not more so, for analysts to have in their training would be a course on Henry James or a course on Shakespeare. I'd rather see a therapist who was really steeped in that kind of literature rather than maybe somebody who's not necessarily, but it adds to sensibility, awareness of what makes people tick at the psychological level. I'm not interested. I could be interested just as an intellectual interest in what the neurophysiological correlates are of whatever it is I'm discovering or working with or experiencing. No, there's nothing wrong with that interest, but it's not essential for nonlinear constructivist learning, NCL, with respect to what goes on between me and patients. No, really. The kinds of statements that if you know how the brain works, everything becomes easier. would you admit that that's a slight overstatement? There might be some things that don't get easier, like facing your death or those of your loved ones, But we are there, actually, to accompany people through life and through the hard things in life. I think Freud was a little bit, in a positivist spirits when he says the goal of analysis is to transform neurotic suffering into normal human misery. It's not so easy to find the line between those two.
I have one specific response, and I'll just use one sentence for that.
That's fine.
There is a website called My Way Out that's controlled by the people in the world who are addicted to alcohol and other things. And if anybody visits it, they'll find that there are a lot of people who are instructed to call me and get treatment for addiction, because I am very knowledgeable with regard to the work of Olivier Amissen in Paris, France, who developed baclofen. Baclofen is a substance which has been used experimentally, and if you take it for a period of a few months, you're no longer addicted. Whatever you were addicted to, you're not addicted to it anymore, including alcohol, and it really works. So I'm just saying, some of the stuff is very practical. I've never had anybody fail, and I get 5 or 10 referrals every day from somebody that who went to My Way Out. I've never visited the website because I don't go to websites that say lots of positive things about me.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
I'll just say quickly, there might be some things where what I call consequential uniqueness does not apply. What you have is inconsequential uniqueness. In other words, you have something that's like an infection and a certain antibiotic, but the person who's, I think, have the obligation to teach us and everyone that you should limit that inclination to generalize to those instances where you absolutely have confidence that something is generalizable and is homogeneous across all instances. The other thing that I would add is that we're in the business not only of discovery, but of creation of meaning, to supplement what Frank was saying. We're not just there finding out what's there, we're also shaping how we are going to be and how the patient is going to be, what the quality of life is going to be for the two of us in the session and in the world.
Okay, Bob?
I didn't express myself quite well enough, or you didn't understand what I was saying quite well enough, because I'm not saying that, the day will come when we can do neuroscience. That's precisely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I do think there is some use for neuroscience, just as there's use for Shakespeare, just as there's use for sociology and a vast number of other things, interesting things in the world, because they provide us with analogies which are interesting and provocative, and that I find interesting. But as
you yourself said, we have to distinguish between those things that are at the same level in terms of universe of discourse.
Absolutely.
And those things that are another universe of
Yeah,
discourse.
and that's
So
and
Shakespeare is on the same level in terms of universe of discourse as psychotherapy. Because it
I'm
has
not.
to do with how people relate
Okay,
to it.
I'm not sure of that, but I do think it's important to recognize that we have a unique, and as psychoanalysts, a unique and very interesting way of engaging people and creativity that is unavailable through any other methodology. I don't want to pick on Fred, but I will. I think your diagnosis of pernicious anemia in your patient is great, but it has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. If I happen to be trained,
Who diagnosed pernicious
I
did not diagnose
okay,
pernicious anemia.
okay,
No, I said B12 deficiency.
okay. You
She had a
diagnosed.
B12 deficiency, which we confirmed by getting it read about
Okay.
the lab in my building.
I'm sorry.
She had no B12.
Fred, I'm sorry.
And she
It was a
recovered
B12 deficiency, not pernicious anemia.
right.
But, okay. But the diagnosis is no more interesting to me as a psychoanalyst than if I, happening to be a physician, recognize that someone has angina or has an ulcer. That's not. There's lots of stuff one needs to know or wants to know about the world, but that isn't psychoanalysis.
Let me add one other thing.
I think Frank wanted to speak.
If I could make one
Go
other
ahead, go ahead,
statement.
go ahead.
When we
Speak into
added-
the mic, please.
Because you're being attacked, doesn't mean
Me- you have to-
when we added psychoanalysis to psychoanalysis, the neuroscience piece, okay? We made friends across the entire world with all the brain scientists. All of those people who I previously collaborated with went out of their way to write me and were so fucking happy and so high on psychoanalysis when we did that. We really opened up the door to them because they thought when we didn't pay attention to the research they did, but they were supposed to pay attention to the research we did, that there was no way to collaborate with us. And since then, they have collaborated with us over and over in all kinds of research and are very friendly to our field when they were not that way before.
It's good to have friends, but Frank.
I know you want to open it up, so just quickly, yeah, I think we're tending to blur what we do as clinicians and what we do as psychoanalysts, okay? And as a psychoanalyst, I have no doubt that there are things that people would do better without psychoanalysis, okay? So it's not about, and nothing I said should be taken to mean that I don't think that there are people who are addicted who have other issues who need other kinds of intervention. But as an analyst, those things do not apply. As an analyst, you're really doing one thing. You're immersing yourself into the experience of the other and trying to discover meaning. That isn't to say that one does not do other things in other instances. So there are different levels of discourse here. And there's a level of discourse about research, too. I know a lot of people are opposed to all psychoanalytic research. I'm not one of them, but it's a different level of discourse. No matter how well the research is done that shows you certain propositions or shows you how well psychoanalysis does compared to other disciplines or other forms of treatment, there has never been a piece of research, and never will, that will inform a particular interpretation for that patient. That will not happen, because those interpretations are based on that individual and the experience of that individual and my experience of them. So the research is very interesting, but it doesn't operate at that level. It's a different level of discourse.
Thank you. Other comments anyone here wants to make before we ask the audience what they'd like to say? Okay. Yes. Christy's bringing the microphone.
I was wondering if, with your definition of science, do you consider religion a science?
No, there's a scientific study of religion, but religion is precisely what Bacon was dividing off from science. That is, the knowledge that is said to be part of religion is revealed. That you can't argue with what one discovered with a religious position. You can only describe its coherence or incoherence or consistency with other things, but the information in religious belief is precisely that. It's not subject to empirical investigation. In contrast, let's say, an interpretation, which gains its validity by virtue of the empirically observable fact of whether or not the patient responds in such a fashion that it expands on what the patient previously was able to say. So they're different beasts.
Yeah, but religion has meaning, too.
Yes, religion has meaning, Psychoanalysis searches after meaning, but they're still different things. This gets to our friend Shakespeare again. Shakespeare's statements appear to us to be often correct because they're narratively convincing to us. They're not, but his statements of general psychological principles are not necessarily true or false. But they're very, very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
To some extent, it's semantic. Like, I guess you could say if you believe in something, well, that's a religion, right? You could say. But it seems to me there's, grounds for saying that an institution that has as its purpose exploration of underlying meanings, critical thinking about beliefs, and what their underlying motives are, and what their psychological purposes are, and so on, is of a different order. If you want to call it the same thing, it's a stretch of what you people would usually mean.
Does not both science in the traditional sense, science in your sense, and science in a religion, and religion all start out from a belief?
Yeah, I'm saying if you want to say, if anything that starts out with an assumption, and there's nothing we do without assumptions, is religious, you could.
Yeah, but I think in the case of religion, it's usually a group belief that it has to do with God, for instance, and that God is acting in a particular way and producing a certain effect. That's very different than our usual scientific questions. How would we prove that God's involved?
You can't. But I'm talking about religion, not God.
Now, religion, granted, offers meaning, but so do a lot of other things. And I wouldn't call them all science. Literature gives us meaning. Okay, Shakespeare gives us meaning. But I wouldn't call it science.
You're diluting the meaning of science when you give your definitions, when you get away from what we consider today classical definitions of science. Now, that's what you're doing.
No, I don't think so, because I'm saying that no literature
You're
is
saying
not...
science isn't that something that's not testable. You don't need testability.
You don't need testability.
You need meaning. It's different.
Here there's a real, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but let me answer, because he's really talking to me. The criterion for a psychoanalytic interpretation is coherence, okay? And I could even argue for you that for every science, ultimately it comes to coherence. Let's take the most sophisticated scientific experiment. Did it prove the hypothesis? Did it not? How do you know? It's whether it coheres with what one expected and what this established knowledge is, okay? So psychoanalytic interpretations are subject to the criterion of coherence, of whether things cohere or they don't. And if they don't cohere, you're wrong, okay? I mean, I have this experience all the time. I know every analyst does, where you offer something and it doesn't fit, and it's wrong. You don't have that experience in religion. That is not religion, and it's not literature, okay? Literature is something different. Religion is something different. They can offer meaning, but they do not subject themselves to that kind of criterion.
Are you referring to fundamentalist religion or to liberal religion, which do have that flexibility?
So, sorry, I'm going to step in. I have three quick questions. Hi. So number one question is about the hermeneutic, non-hermeneutic sciences divide that three of the panelists used. I'm kind of curious. I'm curious about whether that really describes, whether the picture of the non-hermeneutic science is very good at describing what natural sciences are, or if it's not, to some degree, already discredited positivist vision of even what natural sciences do. So for instance, it's very hard, like if the experimental method is the essence of science, then, Darwinian evolutionary biology looks kind of not like science. Astronomy, like the great discoveries of Kepler, look kind of not like science. It's unclear to me how much the kind of sharp line between a hermeneutic and a non-hermeneutic science. I'm somewhat sympathetic with the instinct, but on the other hand, the way you describe the non-hermeneutic sciences don't seem to me like a good picture of what natural science actually does in a lot of cases. It seems to me like something that certain strains of physics and chemistry maybe do. My second question was directed to Dr. Hoffman about kind of the question of on the critique you gave, is therapy worth doing at all? I mean, is really what psychoanalysis really comes down to in a way like a set of metapsychological insights, and that the therapeutic relationship, insofar as it individualizes, insofar as it claims to have a scientific validity by the fact that it's effective, that it works with people, that it has it's a specific relationship that is different from other kinds of relationships people just have, right? I'm wondering the status of therapy after your critique. And then finally, to Dr. Levin, I'd like you to answer the question about Shakespeare, because I'm sympathetic. I think studying the brain, very important, but I think Dr. Summers made a really good argument about it's unclear why a close study of Shakespeare might not be just as important, at least given the current state of things, and even given maybe the nature of human beings as such, than the study of the brain for psychoanalysis.
I'll start because with two comments. One, with regard to you're absolutely correct that the attack on or the description of science from a positivistic point of view is about 80 to 100 years out of date, and that the postmodern understanding of physical sciences, as well as biology, as well as other non-experimental sciences, would support your point of view. In the context we're talking now, however, what I think we all mean by hermeneutic is not simply understanding in coherence in any general way, but understanding in coherence in terms of things like motivation, desire, feeling states, which is a different kind of thing. We wouldn't say, no astronomer after Newton would say that the moon goes around the Earth because of its affection for the Earth. Earlier astronomers did, okay? So there's the hermeneutic that's applicable in psychoanalysis is a particular type of hermeneutic description in terms of human motivation and what meaning in the sense that we intuitively think about meaning. Richard Feynman, for example, said quantum electrodynamics absolutely describes things to 13 decimal points. The only trouble is that he, its inventor, had no understanding of what it meant, and he didn't think it mattered. They didn't understand it. The other thing is when we talk about what we think is important in psychoanalysis, as a consumer, the perfectly reasonable question is, should you go to a psychoanalyst or should you go to somebody else? And insofar as there is data available, basically for all mental, and I'm the author of a book called Does Psychoanalysis Work?, where we exhaustively examined data about exactly all this. Essentially, all mental health interventions work for about 70% of the people who take them. So about 70% of people taking SSRIs get better on them. About 70% of people who enter psychodynamic psychotherapy or CBT. And the fussing is about a couple of percentage points. So that, and in fact, a meta-analysis of psychodynamic psychotherapy outcome research, which is incredibly dull and doesn't get at the heart of psychoanalysis, it's a little better than CBT. So yeah, if you want to talk about it, which pills should you buy, and when you come to the bottle labeled psychoanalysis, is it as likely to be effective as the other bottles? In general, on average, yep. I don't think that's a very interesting finding, but I think it's a legitimate question to ask.
I'll take the question, is psychoanalysis worth doing? I would say yes, especially with me. And I have a couple of openings.
What about anybody else?
I don't know.
You're leaving it open.
I don't know. I think everybody else is full up.
We'll refer you the overflow.
No, but I think that the starting point has to be that it seems clear to me that there's something different about something like psychoanalysis. There might be other things like it that have this in common with it. Namely, there has to be some interest in the process. You know, you don't go for surgery for an appendectomy unless you have appendicitis. Nobody's going to do it because they like the idea of having an appendectomy, per se. You know, it's only because of that. So you have some, you know, or you know, you go for surgery to have a tumor removed or whatever, right? There must be something about, it's clear that this is an experience that is in itself, in some way, in addition to someone's life, as it's going on. It can't be thought of as only a means to an end, right? I mean, I don't think, so it's not for everyone. When you say, is it worth doing? I don't think it's worth doing for everyone. It's worth doing for people who like the kind of thing that it is, who like the kind of conversation that it is, you know? And or like it enough, anyway. They could have, along with that, the sense that it is likely, more or less likely for them to promote change of some kind, for the better. You know, but I would like the way it's advertised, so to speak, to the public, to be less about how an empirical study showed that 70% and so on, because I don't know how that applies to me, right? Now, there's nothing that's going to show exactly how it applies to me until I do it. But I'd rather read, if I were a naive consumer, I'd rather read a book with a set of illustrations of cases, a la the kind of thing Frank is talking about, where the uniqueness of the person in each case is honored. And you see the therapist working with that person. And you see how some kind of relationship evolves and understandings evolve. And you see how changes come about as a result of that. In that instance, I'm not interested in the statistics. They don't mean anything to me. I couldn't care less, right? Because it doesn't apply to me. Those people aren't me anyway. So I have to see that the particular instances of it have an appeal of some kind that is compatible with the person that I am. So I think, oh, I could benefit from that kind of conversation too.
Let me respond to the question about hermeneutic and non-hermeneutic. What I'm criticizing here is Popper, okay? I mean, you know, the idea of Popperian belief system, which is still very popular in philosophy of science as far as I know, is that it's only science if it's a testable hypothesis. And you have to turn it into that. So when you talk about Darwin, which is a good example, okay? Darwin made certain observations, he came up with a theory. You could say, well, he didn't test it, it wasn't experimental, right? But it's been verified over and over and over, right? There are all kinds of ways people have looked for evidence that verify Darwin's theory. And that was Popper's point. It has to be in principle testable. And I think that there are sciences that look for principles from which one derives certain observations. On the basis of Darwin's theory, certain things are predictable, okay? If certain things are going to lead to greater propagation of that species, you expect those things to survive and other things to fall off, and that's what happens, okay? So it's proven by the hypothesis, or at least not disconfirmed by the hypothesis, that Popper would say, okay? Psychoanalysis is not like that, okay? Psychoanalysis is a hermeneutic in the sense that one is looking for meaning, not for hypothesis testing, not to see if we can predict a group of individuals or what's going to happen in the future to groups. Now, you can use it in that way, but that's something different. Okay? So I think there is a difference in looking for meaning and understanding, as Dilthey said, as opposed to looking for explanatory principles from which one could derive instances. And I think that's important in psychoanalysis because I think some people look at it as the latter. And I think that becomes a problem in technique.
Also, psychoanalysts have been analyzed. That is, we've been patients and have gone through our own treatment. And I think that puts us in a better position than other caretakers, because we had a chance to take care of our own issues and resolve them, and we tend to do that on an ongoing basis to maintain our education, you might say, to keep ourselves in a good place emotionally, and not just ignore issues or problems that occur with us. We take them seriously, we deal with them, and if you've been a patient, you know what it feels like to be a patient.
Thank you. You're next.
Thank you. I just want you to address something I put under the label of influences. Thank you. I'm sorry. I want to talk about influences. I don't really believe that it's any one thing that marks change, but many things. And my belief about analysis right now is that it's in transition, that there was a time that analysis was the way to go for a lot of people. It had a very heightened place in the world, and then it dropped down. And I think there is a struggle to get it, in my opinion, it doesn't need validation. I love analysis, but I think that the analysts feel they've got to do something and move with the world. And a lot of the funding agencies, such as government, the way things have gone now, are that they have to have what they call evidence-based treatment, and it is their idea of evidence-based treatment is certainly done with the scientific formula of proving something, and many of the analysts in America are MDs. And so I think that possibly that was a way to latch on to get with what was expected, to get programs in schools or places that the government will fund, that you can't do it unless you play that game. And then I wonder what influences are going to happen as analysis is changing, in that you're having a huge amount of PhDs. And I think in time, the majority probably won't be MDs. Maybe they will. But I think maybe the need to change at whatever time they meet will have a different view of how to handle the problem.
Yeah, I'm sorry to take up so much time, but your question, the first part of your question is in chapter 2 of my book, so I have to respond to it, okay? The way I look at psychoanalysis in the culture is our culture is dominated by 3 basic principles: materialism, objectification, and quantification. Psychoanalysis doesn't fit any of those, okay? That's the hegemonic culture. And when you talk about funding agencies and so on, what we're really talking about is a value system, right, against which psychoanalysis has to operate, okay? And in my view, that's why it's so unpopular. It doesn't fit the values of the dominant culture, okay? So I look at psychoanalysis, and in my book I compare it to Camus' Rebel, okay? Every psychoanalyst, as far as I'm concerned, is a minority, okay? Operating as a rebel against the dominant culture, because you have a completely different value system. Okay, the kind of value system that Erwin was talking about, and the individual relationship with the patient. So yes, it's in transition, it's changing because the dominant culture is going the other way. But it's for that very reason psychoanalysis is needed now more than ever, because we are one of the few bastions of human subjectivity, one of the few bastions where human experience is taken seriously. There are very few others. There's literature, a few humanities, which are also struggling and having trouble. Every area that takes human subjectivity seriously is struggling because of the dominant value system against which we operate. So I think it's needed more than ever, because the tendency toward objectifying the human experience as well as everything else has a tendency to crush the very essence of what it is to be a human being.
Thank you for that. What's the name of your book?
Pardon me?
What's the name of the book?
The Psychoanalytic Vision, the Experiencing Subject, Transcendence, and the Therapeutic Process. There's flyers right on the table here and flyers out and out.
Thank you. I loved your answer.
Yeah, having spent a decade or so on empirical studies of outcomes for psychoanalysis and other fields, I think that was a mistake. Part of the reason we did it was precisely because of the social and particularly economic pressure to basically get insurance coverage. Insurance coverage is not based on empirical evidence. In fact, the whole notion of evidence-based treatment, if you look in it closely throughout medicine, is largely nonsense. What happens is that you end up losing the heart of what you're doing. And I think the best example of this we're seeing now in education, where educators are being forced to try to get students to pass tests rather than educating them. And I think we're at profound risk in mental health professions of basically doing the same thing, trying to prove objective findings which are really of very little interest.
I have one thing I would add to what Frank said, and this is a difference that we've had, and I don't know if it's a real difference or just a matter of emphasis, because, you know, as I listen to Frank, I agree basically, but my whole career has been devoted to fighting within psychoanalysis positivism, which objectivism, that is, as it finds expression in psychoanalytic practice, which is, in my view, rampant in psychoanalytic practice. So it's still the bastion for subjectivity, but there's a lot of knowing analysts who know what's going on with their patient on the basis of certain symptoms or certain kinds of ways of being in the session and so on, and they are willing to, I would say, apply a general. I think Frank gave a couple of examples. Didn't you
Yes,
you
yes,
gave
I
a
did.
couple of examples of that.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. Actually,
they
that's
were from your point of view, they would be perversions of
Absolutely.
what you think of as the psychoanalytic value system. But those perversions are, from my point of view, actually prevailing.
Well,
They're actually
yeah.
the dominant mainstream way of practice in psychoanalysis.
I don't know that that's any longer true. You might be right.
Okay,
I think
maybe
we
it's-
basically agree.
If it's changing, you know, I have some publication plans I have.
No, I agree totally. I mean, that's what, again, the first chapter of my book is all about that, what I call the deductivists, people who think that they can have a theory and apply it to the patient, which I'm totally opposed to. But what I conclude in the chapter is I think the good guys are winning, in the sense that I think analysis is really changing toward getting rid of that and experiencing each individual as unique. I may be idealizing or naive about that, but at least we agree that those two tendencies are there. And the former, I do not regard as psychoanalysis. It's a perversion of what I think the analytic process is. So we agree on that, for sure.
Well, you know, I was at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis for 60 years studying it's a little less than 60 years. I was left back.
I'm a political activist. So what you're saying, Dr. Hoffman, I'm a political activist out there, self-described. So what you've described is really resonates with me. You know, this idea that that analysts will falsely individualize the therapy to the point where the social context is totally eliminated, and the idea that that the patient is suffering from a pathology, the medicalization. Those are instances that are, seem to me, I agree, that's just bad. It's not good. It's not good for it's dangerous then, it would seem to me, for a committed political activist to go into therapy and have the kind of therapist who would indulge in those kinds of, use those devices in his interpretation. But my question is the fault with what the three things you pointed out, the individualism, the pathology, and the medicalization, or are they with the type of I don't want to use the word explanation, but deference to you. But is the fault with the kind of understanding that comes from any kind of an interpretation with respect to, say, let me use an example. Way back when I was in therapy and I was a milkman and I was having problems with my boss. But I happened to come to therapy that day, and I had many sessions in which I was trying to get clear about my relationship to my father and my struggles with authority figures. And the insight that I had with respect to my boss is that I had seen him as an authority figure. I saw him as a kind of a father surrogate or substitute, whatever you call it. And that was valuable to me. But did it somehow vitiate or deflate, the political activism that, that having a conflict with your boss can result in, or should ideally result in? You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Would it undermine that? Or in fact, could it just, be another way of seeing the thing and then going on from there,
Yes, no, I think that your points are so well taken, and I think there are some there are some people in the field who are at least worrying about that, these days. There are books written, there's a book that's out that's called Psychoanalysis, Class and Politics. There's like an effort to, Lynn Layton, who I talk about here, is among the leaders in that. There are people who are trying to struggle with that issue, and it's true. The starting point is something that's like the water to the fish for psychoanalytic therapists or psychoanalysts, which is that's the way we think about things. We think about the individual, their problems, and how they go back in their childhood to their family dynamics, to the extent that it's environment influence, it's the immediate family that's an influence, not the wider social political context, So we have to work like mad to try to overcome that. And there's a certain way in which the business that we're in, I think we're in it, and we benefit from it. The therapist does, because that's the kind of work that the patient also wants. In other words, there's all kinds of interdependent parts there that are very hard to break out of. But I think you're right that it's a challenge for us to try to become a politically critical discipline or institution in the culture, and to actually realize our potential as a critical institution like
that issue.
We are.
Yeah.
We have to work at it.
Sorry. That issue is going to be discussed tomorrow at the panel from 10 to 12, exactly that.
Great. Judy.
Yeah, I don't think it's such a difficult question. I don't think it's such a difficult problem. I think that if you do understand that people live in the real world and have real honest-to-God problems and so on, in addition to having neurotic reactions to them, I think it's a simple matter to have the formulation that as a therapist, you are enabling a person to see the transferential exaggerations in your reaction, and that will enable you, now you don't deny that your boss is a pain in the ass, but it enables you to be better able to handle it in whatever way you choose. That would be the point. If you're going to go denying that the boss has anything to do with what's going on in a person's head, well, then I would say that that is not right.
But it's problematic if a person, excuse me,
Sure.
if a person is working in a company that has certain kind of unethical practices, but your actual knowledge of their history is such that their success in making it in that company involves overcoming all kinds of abuses in their childhood, all kinds of ways in which they were told they could never have power anywhere. It's going to be a little bit conflictual, let's say.
No, it's just going to be very hard, and the person may have to get a different job.
No, they don't want to get a different job. They love their job.
I think you're being vastly over-optimistic
How do you take a moral position?
and not looking at the unfortunate history of psychoanalysis in this regard. And I think the obvious example is the way psychoanalysis dealt with gay people. Until 30 years ago, a gay individual who came in and said that it's hard being gay in this world was told, I am available to help you transform yourself into someone who can fit better in this world. This is psychoanalysis in the recent past. And the question was seldom raised until 30 years ago, is whether the world was an appropriate place to be, that world was an appropriate place to be in, and whether it wasn't a rational task to try to transform that world. Now, I think this is a problem that can easily occur in psychoanalysis, especially insofar as it continues to have a medical knowing position with regard to people and their difficulties, and limits itself to a vision that because the patient has come in and said, oh, maybe I need to change, that the analyst doesn't have a responsibility to think much more broadly than in terms of...
See, I think maybe where some of us are coming from, like Irwin, I was trained at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, and I was really trained to not think about the real world. The real world doesn't matter. Okay, that's how I was trained. I had to undo that training, and I think that's where we're coming from. We've all had that as what we were supposed to do as the model, and it's nonsensical. Okay, and so we're coming out of that, and so I think when you say, well, it's easy, well, it isn't so easy when you've been trained to not think in terms of the real world. And
what I meant was, if you accept the fact that people live in the real world and are coming with real problems in addition to neurosis, then I don't think the way of dealing with it is all that difficult. I understand that you're coming from a much more insular way of thinking. Historically.
And by the way, this is where I think that I would say, rather than neuroscience, psychoanalysts should be studying philosophy. I think a little Aristotle would go a long way in getting psychoanalysts out of that kind of insular way of thinking.
Actually, I'll extend that because, you know, we keep talking about what psychoanalysts should study rather than what they should have done or what life experiences they should have had. And I think the experience, for example, of being a political activist at some point is something most of us don't have, a few of us do, but it reshapes one's worldview like nobody's business.
I know there are a lot more questions. We are out of time. I know Frank has to leave. What do you think about going on, stopping?
I have to go, but I mean, I don't want to stop anyone else from
Why don't we end the panel at this point? Frank has to leave. If people have questions, they're welcome to come up and speak with us.